quote unquote, learn to apply its function being verification or identification, to a person's visage. So to be effective and accurate, these training data sets have really got to be pretty voluminous and diverse. And I want you all to consider that logically, right? It's an issue of parameters and weights derived from AI processing each image in a data set. The more images the more images that are like put into a data set that is fed into the computer software, the more information the AI algorithm is going to have to learn from. And generally, the more robust the algorithm will be at identifying images in the wild. So I want to make a brief comment here about how companies compile training data sets, sort of like the logistical and cost associated with that. As you can imagine, as I said earlier, the larger and more diverse a data set is, generally the better it is for the consequent software. Compiling such an enormous diverse data set is usually an equally enormous task for a facial recognition company. Let's say you've got a company of 20 souls and they want to construct a useful database of, let's say, 1 million unique images. If they wanted to pull those images from their family and friends, each employee is going to need to recruit tens of thousands of willing individuals to create a database. So to save time and resources on building individual consent-based private data sets, a lot of facial recognition companies use data sets already compiled by institutions and large technology companies, or they create their own data sets via like scraping the internet or getting individual consent from singular persons. So let's talk a little bit about why diversity in those training sets is important. As I stated before, you think of it as a data set as a system of parameters and weights assigned to the images processed by the algorithm. The more images you have, the more information an AI algorithm has to learn from, the more diverse those images are, generally the greater educational foundation and knowledge base of the algorithm. But the problem that's going to come from that is that if you have bias in a training data set, that can be transferred to the consequent model. Let's say a training data set is weighed heavily towards a particular demographic, right? Then the software is likely going to work best identifying or verifying that demographic. So if your data set is built with primarily white male faces, say, the software is going to be most accurate when identifying or verifying a white male face, and maybe less accurate at identifying or verifying a non-white, non-male face. And as you guys can imagine, conversely, right? Like the more diverse the data set is, the more effective that software is going to be at applying itself to, the kaleidoscope of real world applications and human faces. For anyone that's been paying attention to facial recognition software at all over the past few years, it's no secret that the imbalances in data sets can lead to real disparate outcomes in application. Academic and government studies have demonstrated that many facial recognition systems in use in public and private sectors misidentify people of color a lot more often than white people due to imbalances in their training data sets. And it's really easy to see how those dangers can be magnified on a large scale. Let's say, as I was explaining earlier, like sort of the prohibitive costs going into compiling a training data set. Let's say only a few academic research institutions, large tech companies have undertaken the Herculean task of compiling a usable data set of face images. If those data sets aren't sufficiently diverse, then really any company using that data set may produce software with inaccuracies, inefficiencies, or biased output. And then you can take that one step further, right? If the lion's share of facial recognition companies are using the same non-representative biased data sets, then the lion's share of software is really going to produce inaccurate, inefficient, biased outcomes. And you've got, given the what I would call obvious application dangers of a lack of diversity in training data sets, it's really important for facial recognition companies to go above and beyond to build software trained on representative and inclusive data. So let's talk a little bit about the law, right? You've got sort of a deluge of privacy lawsuits, currently being litigated under A popular one right now is the Illinois Biometric Information Protection Act and other similar laws. It's natural to wonder whether building those diverse, large training data sets, which, as I said, is critical to making good software, it's natural to wonder whether that's going to violate privacy laws here in the U.S. So I want to say that I want to start off this conversation by saying, contrary to popular understanding, there are no direct US laws about how private companies can use an individual's visage in a machine learning training environment. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood. A number of US states have extensive consumer privacy laws. Here in California, we've got the California Consumer Privacy Act. Voters in the November election of California just passed CPRA, that's the California Privacy Rights Act. That's going into effect in 2023. Those acts generally allow individuals to opt out of the sale of their personal information to businesses. And as I said earlier about Illinois, Texas and Washington are two other states. They've enacted laws directly regulating facial recognition technology. And there's been a bunch of lawsuits about it. But I would say that it isn't clear that any state or federal right of privacy is violated when companies use an individual's picture contained in a data set of human face images to train machine learning software to distinguish features among faces. I'd say part of that is due to the fact that training data sets are used for generalized knowledge of biometric measurements, not for the identification of the individuals involved. Much of the risks our privacy laws are designed to protect. Those are risks like preventing the government from spying on its citizens, protecting an individual's reputation, protecting freedom of speech and thought. They're not really present when geometric patterns of an image are separated from the identity of a pictured person and simply shown to a computer algorithm for measurement, when that image is separated from the confidential or personally identifiable information of the persons whose face is represented. Now, that's sort of the state of the law right now, but that doesn't mean it won't and probably will change. Laws and courts are continually evolving in response to the proliferation of facial recognition technology. So the onus is on facial recognition companies to preempt, anticipate, guard against legal and social risk by building effective, unbiased software and instilling safeguards against misuse and being transparent with their training processes. So, after that very brief overview, let's try and tie it all together and talk about equitable and accounting training data sets. What are sort of the best practices for a facial recognition company? For us at Trueface, right, we're a facial recognition company at the forefront of a new technology, right? So we know that we can't be reactive or ambivalent about the use or consequences of our software. And as I said earlier, the key to good facial recognition software is good data. And good data means diverse, large data sets. So that's got to be ethically and legally collected. And we think that can go a long way to mitigating some of the social ills we've seen, make headlines in our news feeds over the past few years. To properly and ethically train algorithms, you've got to use commercially available images, publicly available images, privately obtained images of individuals. That can be appropriate and ethical because these images are the sort, or either in the public domain to purchase legally, or they're obtained with direct consent from the individuals themselves. A very important aspect here is for the training data sets, you have to separate the images from confidential information of the people whose visages are the subject of the pictures. That way, each individual image is merely fed into an algorithm. The algorithm maps the face, identifying various patterns, such as length between tear ducts, forehead height, et cetera, but confidential information about the individual, name, social security number, credit card information, that cannot and should not be collected. And then most importantly, the images that are going to be used to train facial recognition software have to be used solely for training purposes. I can speak to us here at Trueface. We've never sold our data sets or the individual images that comprise them to anyone ever. we've talked about sort of the collection of the data sets, right? But another key point to this is understanding that, the ethical collection of face images does not mean those images are sufficiently diverse. Each facial recognition company has got to have documented efforts to ensure the diversity of the data sets that, is going to try and approximate our diverse world. I'll call out several of my gifted colleagues here, Mosalam Ibrahimi and Cyrus Baruzi. They've written on Trueface's technical efforts to tackle gender and ethnicity bias in facial recognition. We as a company collect scholarship and open source projects on algorithmic bias mitigation in a GitHub repository. If you guys have any questions on those, those articles are on Medium. Maybe we can post them in the chat here. But they're a good read, and especially those folks can speak to the technical aspect much better than I can. But then even further than that, even after collecting in an ethical way, ensuring a data set is diverse, mitigating bias and misuse is going to go beyond just building the software itself. Facial recognition companies have got to develop contract standards requiring potential clients to adhere to principles of fair application, international human rights touchstones, and the like. If you've got internal standards, you've got transparent publication of efforts to combat bias in the software. You've got this ever-evolving patchwork of privacy and consumer protection laws touching upon the technologies. The other aspect to this is facial recognition companies got to be aware, and typically that means retaining experienced, competent counsel to monitor ongoing legal and business developments in the field, ensuring legal compliance, mitigating risks for themselves, their clients, and most importantly, the folks whose faces are read by the products. Let's see if I can get that to go on. There we go. I'll close out by saying none of this is a panacea, right? And these laws are constantly evolving. There's a couple big lawsuits that were filed back in July in California referencing the Illinois Act that I mentioned earlier. But the key for moving forward as a facial recognition company for us and folks like us is we've got to strive to build unbiased, ethical facial recognition and to be transparent about how it's done. Part of that effort is this presentation. Part of the effort is the articles my colleagues have put out. But I think that's all we've got. So I guess, Mason, do we have time for a little Q&A?
Yeah, plenty of time. If anybody has any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A portion